Hi there, welcome back to the channel and to some new content. Today we're going to be looking at a Toyota Aygo in my car dealer review content. This is going to be special content where we're going to be doing more in-depth reviews of particular makes and models, the reasons why I buy them and crucially what I am looking out for when buying these cars. Now if you're looking to get into the trade or maybe you're in the trade, they're going to give you some more in-depth knowledge now of particular makes and models of what I buy, which will be really useful to you hopefully, using my knowledge from basically being an MOT tester over the last decade, whether that's knowledge of working on these cars or obviously MOTing them and buying them, and what money can be made out of them. Hopefully you'll find this useful whether you're looking just to buy the car for yourself or for a loved one, or maybe looking to trade these types of vehicles on. Now, what are we looking at today? Today we're going to look at a Toyota Aygo or a Citroen C1 or Peugeot 107. They're all the same cars. You can see all three cars here. Come out in 2005 and ran up to 2014 in the Mark 1 form. Had a couple of variations as it went along, mainly sort of front end changes, but reality they are all the same cars. It's just rebadge engineering. Now the car we're looking at today is actually a Citroen C1. It doesn't make any difference. There's hardly any difference at all other than some cosmetics. The mechanicals are all the same. So please bear that in mind today when I'm talking about maybe mention Toyota Aygo or C1 or 107. We're talking about the entire range. They're all the same vehicle. So we're going to have a look around an Aygo C1 in a minute, going through them thoroughly and going on and getting underneath the car and also going for a test drive to get an understanding about what you need to look out for. But first of all, why do I buy these Aygo C1s 107s? Simple, because they are brilliant little sellers. They are super reliable, they are cheap road tax or free road tax, they don't drive too bad and can be easily picked up. And they're not too difficult to prep once you understand what the key things you need to look out for and how to fix them. Which, to be honest with you, if you're going to start off in this game, buying and selling, I would definitely recommend you try and start off with a C1 Aygo or 107. If you can't master one of these, and really, you probably isn't the game for you. So anyway, let's get ourselves outside and have a look at an Aygo C1 107.
Okay, right, here we go. So, a Aygo C1 107. These started out life in 2005, ran up to 2014. Crucial ones you need to remember from buying them is that around 2012 we had a lot of facelift changes on them, so a lot of front end differences. This is the last of the sort of pre-facelift. So in 2012 they changed the front end, arguably on the Citroen version to a nicer front end. But all the range, the Peugeot 107 and the Toyota Aygo said they have not had that front end changes. That's a crucial one. The facelift ones are more popular, but like I said, they're only sort of ran for about 2 years until they were eventually replaced by the Mark II. All of them have the same engine fitted, which is a 998cc petrol engine 3-cylinder, which is made by Daihatsu. They did do a 1.4 diesel. We're not going to cover it in this video because it is very rare, and to be honest with you, no one really bought them. They were pretty pointless. I just don't see the logical point in them. They said the 1 litre was more than enough, was more reliable in my view. Good on fuel, so they were either around 50-60 miles to the gallons these will do, and of course they say they'll cheap road tax. Early ones was a £20, £35 road tax. Around this year, 2012 onwards, the last couple of years they were free road tax as well, which is always a bonus. Now they came in 3 and 5 door models, different variations of trim level. That's really the only difference you'll see in the Citroen Peugeot 107s. Generally the Citroens were more the basey models, particularly the early ones were called VT, so a very base model. They had no central locking on them, no wind me down windows we call them. Very, very basic, and they sort of spec them up to VTR, VTR Plus, etc. The Peugeot 107s were sort of middle of the road. The Toyotas were generally more spec well, so they usually come with alloys. They did platinum models. We've even seen some with sat-nav as well, so they were a lot more specky. Some have rev counters, some don't. Some have rear quarter windows that open on the 3 doors, some don't. Some have glove boxes, some don't. The variations, we're not going to go into that in this video, but pretty much all of them are 95% identical. Okay, so when checking these out, first thing you want to do, get yourself inside and get them fired up. What I'm always doing when they're in the auctions, obviously they're usually always fired up by this point, waiting to come through the sale room. If they're starting up, make sure you're obviously starting fine. I've seen the odd start motor go on them issues, but to be honest, not that common to be fair. Check the steering first. I always put my hand in through the window. I'm always checking the steering, make sure it's got the steering working. If it's not working, it'd be blatantly obvious, it'd be heavy as hell. But that's basically check them out because they do suffer with electronic column faults. Now, they're not that common and not too difficult to fix or anything like that, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. You might find 1 in 50 you buy. It's very rare. I've come across a couple in my time. Not particularly common issue, but it can happen. The main thing you want to be checking out on these, to be honest with you, is clutches. That's the first thing we always check on an Aygo when we're trying to buy them, making sure the clutch is okay. We're going through the auctions, the people are always checking the clutches, or they're asking the drivers about the clutches, where's the bite point is. So what we always do first on this is get it in first gear and lift your clutch up. And you're looking for a nice bite point. It should be no more than sort of halfway up the pedal. So remember, try and use the sort of brake pedal, if you like, as a bit of a guide, so you can see where your obviously the bite is. Now this one's just below the brake pedal, about maybe just over a quarter of the way, which is perfect, roughly where you'd want it to be. Now it doesn't mean that if you're getting a clutch pedal right up the top here and it's very high, necessarily that it's got a knackered clutch. Because what can happen with these is that people basically put new clutches in them and they'll be all right for a bit, so you'll get a nice low down bite point, but then soon after a few thousand miles they can wear again and start to sort of, the pedal starts to rise. And that's down to the fact that these have got cable clutches, quite an archaic clutch system to be honest. But what can happen is people put new clutches in and then they don't adjust them. So you can actually get a situation where you've got a nice new clutch that's pretty decent, but because it's not been adjusted correctly, the bite point becomes very high, and as it beds in the clutch, it can actually cause that bite point to come further up and feel like the clutch is gone again when it just wants adjusting. You can adjust them, there are other ways of adjusting them. Most garages will be able to do that for you. Always get them checked out first and don't assume that they always need a clutch. Now that doesn't mean they don't go through clutches, because they absolutely can. Roughly every 30,000-40,000 miles they'll burn out a clutch in one of these. They're just like that. They're not particularly expensive to do, it's not the end of the world. I'm based here in the northwest of England. Most garages around here will supply and fit you a clutch for around 300 quid in an Aygo. That's sort of the going rate for them. They're really easy, straightforward to do. And if you're an amateurist and you want to do your own repairs, you can do a clutch in these pretty straightforward. They're not particularly difficult. There's a lot more expensive clutches out there, but always remember to make sure you check the clutch first, the actual bite point, and make sure you get it checked over to make sure it's not an issue with the cable itself. Also checking for gear linkages as well, so make sure it's going in gear okay. Now we're going to go on a test drive in this later on to make sure it's going through the gears all right, but you can assess it even standing still by just basically putting your clutch down and going in the gears, sort of lifting it up, going through the gears second and third and stuff like that into fourth and fifth. Usually it's first and third that are tricky to get into gear. You find it more on older cars than later ones, but they do suffer with gear linkage issues. The gear linkages can be bought. We buy maybe a set, we change roughly a set of gear linkages. Every 1 in 5 cars probably will want a set of gear linkages. They're just a bit taut and stiff. They're never the most sleek of gears changing on these Aygos and 107s. You know, they're not like smooth and silky, but they shouldn't be tough to get in gear. If you find you're tough getting in gear, you probably want a set of linkages. The linkages, like I said, can be picked up on eBay. We buy them from. They're about 40 or 50 quid, about half the price for the same linkages you get from motor factors. So obviously stiff gears, make sure you look out for that. Obviously if you had a really badly worn clutch, that could also cause a stiff gears as well, so always bear that in mind. But 9 times out of 10 it's always the linkages. As a rule of thumb, if we put a clutch in one of these, we always change the gear linkages, adjust the clutch up and put a new clutch in. Basically just to rule everything out. Internally on the trim bits, looking for things like door handles. These are always falling off, these trim pieces. You've got the external cover that comes off and also the internal bit as well that's actually attached to the door card. They can come off as well. These are readily available from places like eBay. We buy them online. You can get them in any colour, grey or black's most common. Pick them up for like £5 or £10. It comes with the inner and outer cover, so you can repair them. We usually keep them in stock. They're always coming off. People trying to glue them or put self-tappers in. I've seen some right messes over the years. Just buy them, change them, replace them. It just smarts a car up. And actually you need it, because actually when you're opening and shutting these doors, you want to make sure you're pulling this shut. There's no real other way of actually pulling the door to other than ripping the handle apart. Always check hazard switches. They can go faulty. They always look horrible and cracked. They're just all like that. If you want to change one, you can. For aesthetic reasons, but more for the actual functionality, because they do go wrong, these hazard switches. Again, pick them up on eBay. They're not expensive. I'll put you a picture of one here and give an example of how cheap they are to buy. Don't go to the main agent and buy one. They are no different. What's the point in spending 10 times the price for a hazard switch when you can get one for a fraction to do the same job? Main thing you want to check on these as well, a really important one, is actually making sure the heaters are working on the settings. Now, these can suffer with the blow motors packing up on them. You want to make sure it's working on all the settings. To be honest with you, they usually just burn out and they just stop working altogether. Now, on most cars, it could probably usually about an hour or so to get to a heater motor. However, unfortunately on these, you've got to rip the entire dash out. It is an absolute pig of a job. In fact, it's more easy to do a clutch in one of these than it is actually to rip the dash out and change the blow motor. Blow motors are not expensive to buy. You can buy them online again or get them from salvage places online. There's no issue about getting hold of them. It's just a pig of a job to do. So yeah, it's going to be a fair few £100 for a garage to rip out a dash and put a motor in one of these, unless you're feeling really adventurous about ripping a dash apart. Keys as well, always check your keys, make sure your central lockings are working. The keys always seem to fall apart on Citroens and Peugeots and Aygos. The buttons seem to come away. As long as you've actually got the buttons in there, so i.e. the solders haven't dropped off, these should actually still function. Now, this one's not working, it probably just wants a new battery. We actually keep these fobs in, just refurb them. You can buy the fobs online. They're about £5 to buy, even less than that I think. Easy to do, you just literally take that screw out, take them apart, put a new battery in, and job done. I always recommend you do that because a lot of people actually break these keys or they stop functioning and then they have to use the key on the door, and the barrels on these are really weak point, and you can actually get issues with the barrels where they sort of fall to pieces, and it's a real pig of a job to actually get them replaced, and you have to end up having a spare key with it. So we just always make sure that these are working because it'll just save you a lot of hassle with the door locks. Right, moving on out. Always check check straps as well. Sometimes these can go about 20-30 to buy. They're not the cheapest check strap in the world, but they are common for going. They open your door, you can hear it clicking there. There's an example of a bad one. We keep these in stock, but again, just a couple of bolts there and take this inner card out and you can get that check strap out and replace it. Just a bit annoying, that's all. Now, moving on, you want to be checking on these vehicles for damp. This is one of the major issues that you'll get with one of these Aygos and C1s. They do let a lot of water in. The main one's obviously the boot area, but also while you're there, always just check the floor pan, make sure you've got no water coming in down these sides here. I've seen some of these where the seals have gone here. Very rare, it's a lot more common for the boot problems, but you can get seals going on the doors. So always make sure you check door seals, make sure you've not got no damp carpets. Right, moving on to the back, and this is a crucial one, is checking these for damp because they are really bad for damp. Pretty much all of them at some point in their lives are going to get a bit of damp in them and let a lot of water in. So the main thing you want to be doing is actually popping the boot and seeing if you've got any water in there first off. Now this one's been checked and done, so we know this one's all right. But obviously I'll go through the motions with you. Just take that parcel shelf out of the way there so you can see better. But you want to be lifting this carpet up, and what you'll find is most of the time this will be sodden if it's really bad. Lift it up and actually check to see if there's any water in there. If they're really bad, you'll see loads of water flooding in the boot. There is a drainage hole at the bottom here, so you can actually poke that through and get the water out, and then just obviously mop it all up. Most of the time you'll find water leaking from the left-hand side, particularly down here on the sides and getting into the spare wheel well. Now the main areas where these leak are behind the actual rear lights and also the top brake light. Now that's the main one, the main culprit, I'd say the top brake light. As you can see here, this one hasn't been done yet, which is why we need to change it. But you can see here there's a massive gap in the actual brake light here. It's supposed to be a foam board behind there, and over time that sort of erodes. Now we buy the seal kits for these. In the seal kits, which I'll put the link here in the description, you get 2 pads for the lights and the upper seal as well. You can just mask them up. You can just take these off, clean them, and basically gork them with sealant. Use a black sealant, it makes you do a neat job. You don't want loads of sealant around here making a mess. Or you can just buy the foam kits like we do. Put them in, and that solves the problem. A lot of times as well, when these leak, these upper brake lights, they get water up on the top here, and you can feel it. Sometimes it can fall down the side as well into the spare wheel well on the right or left side. So make sure you check them out. The lights as well, I've got an example of one here on a Toyota Aygo, which are very slightly different. The pads in them, they're not the same pads as on the C1s and 107s, but it's the same principle, they'd still leak. The pads actually sort of erode and fall apart, and water gets in behind the light and falls down the side into the boot area. Rule of thumb we do now is we just change them all. So this one we'll have them changed before it goes on sale, as an example, because as I said, they're just so common. For every 3 we get in, 2 end up having water in the boot. Another area they can leak is on the main seal itself on the glass. So it's quite rare, but although it can happen, telltale signs you'll see is any sort of marks on the glass itself. You'll actually see any sort of residue or algae or sort of water ingress on the actual seal, where the glass meets the seal. You can also see as well on the seal, you'll be able to see where any leakages are. Now this one's actually a good one, it's not in too bad a nick, but we have had to change these. I'd say probably for every 10 we get in, one of them ends up needing a new seal. You can buy the seals direct from the manufacturer. To be honest with you, we've started buying them from another company that Retro makes them, and they do a decent job actually. I'll put the link here in the description. They're a lot cheaper, but also they fit better. When you put the new ones on from the manufacturers, yes, they work, but what happens is that you have to end up messing around adjusting these locks here because they just don't sit right, so you end up having to slam the boot all the time, trying to get it to sort of grab. So you end up having to fettle with it, and it takes ages for them to sort of settle down. The way you'll find as well if they're leaking as well, an obvious one is literally, what we end up doing on these is just tipping water everywhere. So literally, you just get a hose pipe or a bucket or whatever, just tip water down these edges here. This one's obvious, obviously, where it will leak into, but actually take it water and pour it or hose pipe on around these lights and stuff, get all the carpets out, and you can actually see where they're physically leaking into the car. Also as well, a little bit less rare, but can happen behind the bumper as well, the vents can also leak. So there's actually vents behind the bumper and they can leak in, the plastics fall back and they let water in. They don't fall on the floor, it actually gets in back into the car and gets into the spare wheel well area. They need to take the bumper off to do that and reseal them. But that is the main area where these leak. When they're really bad, they flood the cars out. You get wet rear seats, wet rear carpets. They are a bit of a pig to clear out. But occasionally you'll come across one of these that's really damp, and if you've got the time and the effort to take one out, clean them all out properly, do a proper job, get all the seals in, you can end up buying a really cheap car and turn it around and have a good squeeze of profit out of it. So don't always assume that because you see a damp car that it's one to walk away from. It's priced accordingly. In the past we bought them damp, fixed them and put them back on sale because we've got them at real handy money. Another one to check for is bumpers, front and rear bumpers. Make sure they're all sitting properly. Now, they're never going to be perfectly lined up. They never did. They are obviously built to a price cars. They're not going to have a perfect flush line like a German car. But they should be in reasonably straight order. Make sure they match up properly. Make sure they're not coming apart. Also, watch out for paint issues as well, particularly red cars, which are the most pain for lack of peeling. But some of these blue ones like these can do it. Even some silvers as well I've seen with some lack of peel. Pretty much all of them have a bit of lack of peel, if I'm honest with you. But it just seems to be red and blue that seems to be the most notorious for that. You usually see it around bumper edges, round here, example, or maybe on the bonnet or front bumper. Look, don't walk away from one that's got a few little dots here and there, but if it's absolutely streaming off, obviously you're going to have to be careful, because if it's got loads of lacquer coming off, it's going to affect the price of what you can sell it for. It's not going to look aesthetically pleasing, and obviously you're going to have to get that addressed and painted. Let's pop the bonnet. Okay, under the bonnet there you can see a lovely 998cc engine. Now we haven't done anything to this one yet, so it's probably looking a little bit scruffy, a little bit of residue down there where someone spilt some oil. Now in reality these engines aren't going to give you too much grief. They're a pretty decent engine. They do naturally sound a little bit tinny, particularly when you drive them as well, as you'll probably hear later on when we drive this one. Main things to look out for on these is blowing exhaust. That's one of the major ones you'll be checking out for under this bonnet. Now, it's a 3-cylinder engine. You can see the manifold here with the catalytic converters built onto the front of the engine. We call it a maniverter. And what can happen is you can just start to see this one starting to go, but it's probably a while off yet, is it's just starting to corrode at the top here. They're built to a price vehicles. They're a bit flimsy, these manifolds, and they can corrode quite easily. Eventually it blows the gasket, and because the corrosion's quite bad, you can never really reuse these. You end up having to replace the manifold or catalytic converter on the vehicle. Now you can buy these aftermarket. We usually get them from companies locally to us, pick them up for about between £70 and £100. The beauty of it is actually these original Toyota ones are actually worth quite decent money, i.e. on the scrap market. So you can actually get about half your money back by scrapping one of these off, because they've got decent weight in them of precious materials. If you ever get one done by someone, make sure you get the old one back, because it actually is worth a little bit of money. At the moment, catalytic converters aren't greatly priced, but sometimes when the market's up, you can get like up to £100, £150 for some of those cats when the market's been booming in the past. Like I said, replacement maniverters are never going to be as good a quality as the ones ready for manufacture, but they'll do the job and they'll certainly outlast the car. And I've never had any issues in fitting them or any problems with getting them through the MOT tests. If you hear anything, you'll be hearing a blowing noise or a very raspy noise coming from the front. It is very obvious when you have a blowing manifold on one of these Aygos. Make sure your lights are always secure, because these are a bit flimsy, and sometimes you get a bit of bump on the front end, these lights can be dislodged, so make sure they're all nice and secure. Same with your bumper, make sure they're nice and secure. They'll say they're a bit flimsy as well, the bumpers. Obviously you're always checking for accident damage, make sure there's got no nasties or anything. You can see the exposed chassis legs here on the driver's side. Again on the passenger side, you've got quite a lot of area there you can actually see. You can stick your head in and have a proper look. Other things, briefly, I've seen the odd starter motor fail on these, but it's very rare. Also the odd alternator. I've seen the odd noisy alternator as well. You'll hear a pulley noise. If that was the case, it'd be quite prominent. So obviously the alternators aren't expensive for these. You can pick them up for around £100. It's not the end of the world to change one of those. It's probably something you could do yourself, to be honest, and not particularly difficult. Now remember, these are timing chain driven, not cam belt driven, so you haven't got to worry too much there about replacement of cam belts on it, because obviously it's chain driven. I've seen the odd one that needs a chain now and then. It is very rare. If it is, it makes a distinct sort of pinking noise when it's running. Don't get that confused with the general noise of the engine. They do sound very tinny. If it's got a chain noise on it, it'll make itself obvious. Like I said, I've seen very few of them that actually have stretch chains. They're quite a reliable unit, like I said. They're probably one of the best small units out there currently at this sort of age and era. Okay, so that's what you need to be looking out for as a general sort of walk around. Obviously, you're looking at tyres as well, you're looking at brakes, you're doing the obvious things you're going to be looking at every car, checking the bodywork and assessing it. I'm just trying to pinpoint out the exact things that to this specific model that you need to be looking out for, just to make sure you can actually pinpoint certain issues and common issues on these particular models. Now, we're going to get this up in the air now and give you an idea of what we're looking for when they go to MOT, and other things you can probably still check and look out for, particularly in regards to corrosion. So let's get it up in the air.
Okay, so let's have a look underneath the Aygo C1 107s. What are they like? Obviously, they're all the same underneath. There's no difference underneath and no structurally difference between a 107 and an Aygo. They are obviously the same cars we mentioned before. Now, obviously, I appreciate, obviously, we've got this on a hoist, and that's not going to be accessible to everyone in order to check this over, obviously, when buying one, whether you're going to be buying one for yourself or buying one to trade on. However, it's just more about sort of pointing out the things that MOT testers and garages are looking for when you get these on the ramps, these Aygos and C1s. Plus, there is obviously some checks you probably can do, even on the floor, which I'll show you now. The most important one being some basic corrosion checks, which you really do need to be doing on these, because they do corrode, particularly of a certain age. Now, this one's a 12-plate one. You wouldn't expect to see it on something like this. However, you just never know. It's more sort of older ones. I used to get into tests recently, sort of around the sort of 2000 and sort of maybe 8, 9. They're starting to get a little bit sort of corroded on the back. Now, where they usually go on C1s and Aygos is this corner here. Now, obviously got the ramp leg here in the way, so you can't properly see, but you can just see this sort of the starting of some sort of surface corrosion appearing. Now, this is absolutely superficial. This is fine. This is what you expect to see of this sort of era. And a bit of flaking on the axle, it's also fine. I've never really seen one of these axles particularly go. They do always look a bit sort of ropey. I mean, this one's starting to peel now, as we can see. We usually clean these up and just smarten them up just for, just make them look nice, and obviously try and get a little bit of corrosion prevention. But there's where you need to be focusing on, these corners, both sides, where these mounting points are. So the axle mounting point, and obviously this is part of the sill. If you had any corrosion or holes in the inner parts of the arch here, or the inner or outer sill area, obviously this would fail MOT, because it's 30 centimetres from a prescribed area being a sort of suspension mounting point where these axles are. Now, you could actually see these if they're on the ground by simply just poking your head under. Now, as you can see there's an example there of a little bit of just start of where you're starting to see a little bit of surface corrosion. Now, go down a couple of years later on a car, maybe sort of, like I said, a few years older, you'll start to see these going really soft under your thumb, and that's where you need to be sort of checking and poking and prodding, because they start to rot here first. Usually they get a bit of water in them and start corroding out. As you say, you can repair them. We've repaired many of them. Nice little plate in there, nice and flush, and you've got a nice line here to work to. So if you had a flip can, you could repair it and do a proper aerosol job, or maybe even blow it in if you've got the paint. Or you can just do a Schultz line, so you can get a rubber guard or an under seal, repair it properly, and then use this line and mask it off and put a new Schultz line in. Again, obviously on this inside where this mounting bolt is, you can stick your hand in there, make sure it's nice and solid. And that one is solid, a little bit of surface corrosion there. We'll probably re-black these anyway, so it isn't too bad. But that's where you're checking on both sides of the sills. Make sure you check those inners and outer sills. Should be easy to be able to inspect them on the ground. This one's quite solid on this side. It's usually near side, you'll see worse than the offside, where salt sort of congregates in the road. But again, that's quite solid and structural. Like I said, as a rule of thumb, we sort of under seal all these Aygos and C1s anyway, just for peace of mind for the customer. It just looks nice as well. Other than that, on the corrosion side, there's not too bad. I mean, the sills can start to go here of a later age. You're starting to see a little bit of surface corrosion there, but that is really solid metal, so I won't be too worried about the sills so much. They're not rot boxes on the floor pans or anything. However, you can get subframes go. It is quite rare, but I have seen one or two. And again, it's usually on very older models, particularly sort of, later on models. Remember, they started these in 2005. So it's more those older ones you're starting to see where the subframe's gone. Where you'll be seeing the corrosion is roughly around here where the anchor points are for the wishbone arms. You can get holes here. I mean, this one is solid as a rock, so we've got no issues there. But obviously, you need to be aware of that. You probably could see underneath and pop your head under and see a subframe on the ground and sort of see where these mounting points are for the arms. See if you see any corrosion there. You want to just check them out. But really, the main point you're going to be checking out is the back end of the car, particularly those inners and outer sills. So that's basically the corrosion checks you need to be doing. From an MOT perspective, obviously we're checking for those as corrosion. That's the main one we're looking for. The other things that are sort of generic to Aygos and C1s, obviously we're looking at rear brake pipes, and this is a classic example. So the brake pipes on these are quite odd. See, they're covered and got a shroud around them. unfortunately, the exception of the last sort of inch and a half, as you can see here, where they're exposed, and they just seem to have a habit of corroding quite prematurely. So like I said, this is a 12 plate one. I mean, it's fair to say it is quite an old car, but they are starting to go there. Now, you could clean that up and it might be okay. Sometimes you just get a bit of blistering and it's not as bad as it looks. However, you do need to wear they can corrode quite fast, and obviously I have seen a few of these burst actually, particularly when they've gone on a brake test and the rollers. So you need to be aware of that. That one looks a bit worse actually. Now, it's a bit of a sticky point with brake pipes and MOT testing. As a rule of thumb, we're supposed to use I mean, it's ridiculous really, a guide of saying it's as the internal diameter. I'm trying to remember roughly the guide, but as the internal diameter of the brake pipe reduced by about, it's a third or a quarter or something ridiculous. I'll put the exact sort of description here, what they're on about. But in reality, you use sort of common sense. Now that's starting to get really crusty, and to be honest with you, you'd be looking at that as a borderline fail. That one of those things where you get two different opinions from two different testers. That is a pretty bad brake pipe. It's starting to reduce in size externally. How you assess it internally, God knows. I mean, it's a silly rule, but a rule of thumb, if it's starting to look really bad and starting to look like it's going to break or burst imminently, you're probably going to end up failing a ticket, failing an MOT. To replace that, literally, you're going to have to, obviously, you could try and piece it in if you can find a decent enough piece to piece it in with. We've sometimes done that in the past, but mainly, really, you're just going to end up changing the whole pieces that they run across the fuel tanks and obviously down and along the floor pan. So they're quite common. It's quite daft really, because the rest of the pipes are all covered in shrouds, with the exception of this 1 inch that's exposed to the near side and offside rear. Another one we're looking at as well on these is anti-roll bars. They always look horrendous, and here's a classic example again. So you can see here, you see the bushes here, I can quite point them out. Those bushes are really, really poor condition. They always seem to fall apart. They always look worse than they actually are, so I bet if I barred that now, there'll probably be slight play in it. So I've seen them in a lot worse condition than this, and they've still not managed to fail the MOT, because it doesn't matter what they look like, it's how much play is in them. So don't get fooled by, obviously the cosmetics of how they look. We don't work, let's just put a torch on there for you. We don't work on how things look, it's done on the basis of what plays in there or how deterioration. Now, in this case, obviously, the fail criteria would be an anti-roll bar bush has excessive play. So it's nothing to do with the fact of how it looks or deterioration of it. It can be absolutely deteriorated to hell, but if it's got no play in it, it can't fail an MOT. Now, they always look like this on these Aygos. As a rule of thumb, we keep them in stock and just change them because they're so cheap to do. And, most of them will have a little bit of play in them. And what is the point for how cheap they are not replacing them? Because when they make a racket, my word, they make a racket. And obviously, you don't want customers coming back for the sake of a, £12 set of drop link bushes. The other one, which you previously mentioned before, which is checking the exhaust system, particularly at the front. And obviously, you're looking for blows, in particular where this manifold is at the front, so this catalytic converter manifold, or a manivert it might be called. They can blow, say, crack and rot, like I mentioned that before earlier on. Now, the rear back boxes can blow, usually on this joint here where they blow, that's usually where you'll find them blowing, or particularly sometimes on the bracket here, they can sometimes get sort of pinholes in them and blow, or where they connect here on this joint here, this clamp can some sort of deteriorate and get blows there. The main one you'll come across with them is they just sound really noisy and echoey. I mean, this one's just got a little bit of rust going on the seam here, so it's probably on its last legs. However, this one internally, if you can actually bash it, sounds all right. What happens with these is because they're not particularly expensive exhausts, they're cheaply made. They've got baffles in them, like most exhausts, to drown out some of the noise. But over time, because these are quite produce a lot of condensation, these engines, and water, obviously, for the catalytic converter process, the water gets trapped in these baffles here and it sort of rots them out. And eventually they sound quite noisy and tinny, quite loud and raspy. And it's just the way the baffles have collapsed in them. And sometimes when you bash them, you'll actually hear the baffles all sort of rattling around in the boxes. Now, obviously, an exhaust that's got collapsed baffles is not necessarily an MOT fail unless it was really loud, which is, on these is unlikely. But it is the sign of a failing exhaust. And obviously you might want to be changing them. I've changed them for aftermarket ones, decent examples and cheap ones. To be honest with you, they all sound a bit raspy, to be honest. I've never found a real good example of the back boxes without buying a genuine one, which is really stupid money. Most of the aftermarket ones just all sound a little bit raspy. You can pick up exhaust for these for around 50 quid. They're pretty easy to get hold of. Other things we notice on these in the MOT game is these wheel bearings, particularly rear ones, can be quite noisy. You'll probably pick that up on a test drive anyway, so obviously make sure your wheel bearings, when you get up to speed, you've got any rumbling noises or sort of droning noises, probably wheel bearings. Most of the time it's rears. I've done the odd front one as well, but it's usually rears for some reason. That seems to be most common. Other than that, really, everything else is just general wear and tear items, which you'll find on any car. Right, let's get it on the ground, and then we'll go on the test drive. Okay, right, we're out on the road. So, what are we looking out for when test driving a C1 Aygo and 107? Well, first thing you're going to be making sure of is checking those gears and that clutch. That's the crucial one. Now, if you're lucky enough to have a test drive, something we don't have when we're buying these in auction, what you want to be doing is basically just going down the road, getting it into a sort of a high gear for the sort of speed you're at, and try and put it under load. By doing that, one, you're making sure the engine's running right, and making sure you've not got any misfires, but also you're checking the clutch itself to make sure it's not slipping. Now, the clutch pedal's high, but crucially you can't make it slip, but I'll be going more down the routes, potentially, of it really just needing an adjustment of clutch, rather than actually needing a new clutch. Like I said, it happens so many times, we come across these, where people have had clutches in them, probably in the last year or 2 years, they've only done a few thousand miles in it, and then they've got a high clutch again, but it isn't slipping, but the bike's really high, so they should assume the clutch is gone again, and it isn't. It's just mainly because half the time, when mechanics and garages put these clutches in, they don't reset up the clutch properly, because when they put a new one in, because it's got nice new material, the bike naturally falls further down anyway, so just assume it's better than it was and send it out. I've done so many of these recently where you get them in, there's nothing wrong with the clutch, it just wasn't adjusted properly in the first place. So that is a key way of making sure you distinguish between one that's slipping, that generally is worn out, and one that just probably just wants adjustment. Also as well, crucially, talk about gearboxes. We mentioned about checking for notchiness in the gears, that's crucial. Make sure you're changing it through and it should be flowing relatively nice. It's not slick, they're not slick gears, but it should clink into place nicely. If it's really having to force it in and it's resisting, yeah, you've probably got worn linkages, gear linkages, not clutch cable, gear linkages, as we mentioned earlier. Also listen out for synchro issues as well. Not that common, but I have had the odd one now and then, particularly second or third gear, when you've gone into second or third and you're getting a little bit of a crunch in the gearbox and the synchro itself. Now, if you've got a worn clutch, to confuse things matters, or a worn gear linkage, that can also cause a crunch in second or third, or even first. And sometimes it isn't the gearbox, it's just the fact the linkages are worn, for example, or the clutch is worn. So it's a difficult one, so it can be a difficult one to diagnose. But I have had the odd one where it really has worn out the actual synchro in the gearbox and I've had to change the gearbox, but that is very rare. Now listen out for things on the suspension. These are generally going to be, not the most finest things to drive. They're built to a price. They're cheap little small cars. So they are going to be a little bit rattly and noisy. But you shouldn't be hearing any sort of thumping or sort of clanging or anything like that. Generally, they're quite robust for what they are. They can take a bit of punishment. Rear shockers, though, are common for going wrong, particularly sort of losing damping effect. In fact, this one is a perfect example of where I can hear the back end going over speed bumps, where it's just been a bit crashy and bouncy and a bit noisy. Worn out suspension shockers, really. That's basically what the problem is. It is quite common. Just remind me, actually, I've just put the indicator on. Stalks on these as well are quite common for going wrong. Again, dead easy to do. It's something you can do yourself, to be honest with you. You've only got to take this cowling off the steering wheel and you can change these stalks. I'll put you a link here where you can get them from. We just buy them off eBay. Don't waste your time buying from the main agents. They're too dear to buy, and the ones you can buy off eBay all work just the same way anyway. And finally, just talking about that engine when driving these, they will sound really tinny and raspy. They are like that. They actually have quite a lot of piston slap in these engines. They're like that from new. It's very rare you're going to come across one of these with a bad engine. Extremely rare. Which is why I like them so much and they're such popular sellers. So let's talk about that, about buying and selling them. Now, as a rule of thumb, you want to be buying ones roughly nowadays around sort of the 2009, 5809 to up to 14, the Mark 1 shape. Now, prices are going to vary completely on condition and mileage. High mileage ones still sell. I mean, I wouldn't be going to venture across the sort of 120,000 mile mark, to be honest with you. I'd be keeping it sort of 100,000 or below. Slightly over is not the end of the world, but ideally you don't want to be going too high up the mileage chain. They'll do it. I've seen these of 160, 70,000 miles on, but you're not going to have much market for one of those. Buy a nice one, buy a half decent one, and particularly one that's a decent, half decent spec, or decent colour at least. If it's a nice colour, they'll sell well. Bright blues are popular, the silvers are popular. Ideally keep away from red, unless it's a really good condition one and it's really bright. I would just keep away from them because they just peel. So make sure you're checking the basics. The main ones, checking for that corrosion, because that is an absolute killer. Also making sure the clutches are all right. If you can assess that, get your head underneath, check properly, get yourself in the car, go on a test drive if you're lucky to do that. And if you've got a half decent one that drives really sensibly, these are really easy things to turn profit out of. Roughly, I mean, this is now what, April 2024, so these prices obviously going to be more relevant to today. But at the moment, a 2010, 11, 12 plate C1 under the sort of 1,500 quid mark to buy in, that's in really good condition, is going to have some profit in it. You'd be easily expecting to get anywhere between sort of 22 to 3,000 pounds for one, obviously depending on mileage and spec. This one's a 2012 plate with 103,000 miles on. Now, from a dealer's perspective, we're probably going to get about $24.95 for this. I wouldn't say this is an absolute mint condition one. It's okay. It's about bang average for the mileage. But that's roughly what you'll get for one on a 12 plate. Slightly older, you're going to be looking more around the £2,000 mark. You can pick these up in the auctions. Most auctions you'll go to will have an abundance of these in stock because they are everywhere. Why? Because they're popular and they're good to sell. Also on the private market as well, particularly Facebook Marketplace. That might be an interesting one to try and pick one up from, particularly if you can find one that needs a clutch or might have damp issues or anything like that. They're really good little finds out there where you can buy them, turn them around and try and make a profit out of them. And they attract all ages. We've sold people these who are first-time drivers, 17, 18 years old. We've sold people in the 50s, in the 60s, 70s, even the 80s. Everyone will buy one of these, male and female. And that's what you want from a car that's universal, that anyone will buy. Okay, I think we've pretty much covered everything in this video. Now, I'm no doubt we'll have missed some things. If anyone thinks I've missed anything, let me know in the comments. I hope you found this useful. And like I said, if you're starting out in the trade, definitely start with one of these. If you can turn one of these round and make profit out of it, then it's a great stepping stone to try on and move on to some other cars, because these are very cheap cars to buy, fix and sell on. So anyway, thank you for watching this video, guys. Please let me know your thoughts on these types of videos. Do you want me to do more of these type of content? So thanks again. Please like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so, and I'll see you all in my next video.